show them at the end, but start off on some basic overviews and make sure to answer your questions. So the format of the exam, which will be the same for all the in-class exams, is going to be 25 multiple choice questions, and then there'll be 5 what we call short answer, but we're not asking for essays. I mean, there's too many of you. All right, so they'll actually be mainly sort of fill in, short phrases or labels, things like that. And there'll be so there'll be 5 of those, but you'll be able to choose. Haven't finalized it yet, but choose out of 7, so you have some choice there too. Okay. In the past, we had you do a mini essay, or short answer, whether it could be bullet points. In this case, it'll be clearly described. There'll be choices, and you'll be able to fill it in. Okay. And there might be a little drawing that you'll have to do. All right. That format will be repeated through all the in-class exams. Okay. So it is a little bit more heavily weighted toward multiple choice, but there's a bit more work for the short answer fill-in, so that they basically kind of offset themselves, sort of equally weighted in terms of your effort. Okay. It gives you a different way of being able to tell us what you know. All right, so I thought I'd go over a few things. Unless somebody's really dying to ask a question right now. Oops, somebody stood up, sort of start at the beginning and then really focus heavily on the axe potential, which of course brings in the resting potential. Talk a bit about synaptic transmission. And then we'll leave to the end any questions about synaptic plasticity, which you just had a lecture on, but I know you probably have a few questions on. So is that okay? We'll just sort of dive in. And I would recommend, you can take notes, but if you have access to the PowerPoints, go look at them, all right? So it's not a question of checking, but it's more a question of as we go along here, you can review it. Because I'm going to do most of this basically as a overhead, all right? If there are certain questions, though, or you want to look at what's in the PowerPoint and say, I don't get that, we have a computer up so we can pull that up as well. Okay. So this is somewhat unstructured. I'll start out with reviews, but you can ask questions as you go along. If you want to go off in a different area and have a discussion, you need to let me know. So this is for you. Okay. So I thought we'd just start very generally, because this is what it's all about, isn't it? Hopefully you can see it. I'll try to write a little bit here. Hopefully you can read that. Neuronal signaling. That's all what the nervous system is about, right? Signaling here and there, and whether it's thinking or instructing your muscles to move, or you're feeling something, or what. It's all about navigating your environment, interacting with your environment. Okay. So when we talk specifically about encoding, or neural encoding, but really what I was talking about here was along the axon, along the nerve fiber. What were the 3 things that I talked about that was important to have in mind as really the underpinning of all encoding of signals? Okay. Remember the axon, it's conveying an axe potential, so it's really basically like a digital unit, right? So that's encoding a signal, and really a set of signals. So this goes all the way back to the first lecture. It was in a box.
Timing.
So timing, right? Timing is everything, right? So timing. So that's a basic thing to know, but just to expand on that a little bit, obviously timing is critical. That axe potential has to arrive to release neurotransmitter in the muscle just at the right time, okay, to contract, to do something. If it's early or late, what will happen? The movement will be jerky. So it's timing. What's one of the other 2?
Frequency.
So frequency. So obviously that's encoding, how often something's happening, but what is it actually encoding in terms of communication from a nerve cell to another? So that nerve cell has an influence, right, which is dynamic. It can vary. It could be a real strong stimulation, or it could be a weak stimulation, or it could have two different types of stimulation. We'll come to that in a second. Okay. So what is frequency encoding then? It's one thing to say, okay, frequency is part of encoding, but I don't want a circular argument. What is it actually encoding in terms of that influence of the upstream cell on the next cell? The strength, right? So strength is not ever encoded in the size of the action potential. Action potential is all or none. It's set, so you get a digital unit, and so so the stronger the activity, the stimulation that is from the upstream, okay, the higher the frequency. And what's the last one? Pattern, right? So now we get into all the sophistication then of signaling, right? So yeah, strength is one thing, but the patterns, whether they're bursts, whether they go up, they go down, and any possibility is out there in terms of variation in pattern. So you have when it happens, you have the strength of it, you know, how strong it is, but also that pattern. That's what's encoding all our thoughts, our emotions, and everything. It's all in there. You don't know how to decode it in every case. So that's on the axon. All right, then what about at the synapse? Now I'm talking about signaling now. Okay, generally. So we talk about encoding, neural encoding, we talk about the action potential and those three things. But to expand on this, it's not just the axon, right? Not just the action potential. It gets all the way down to the nerve terminal, and it converts, again, the electrical signal into a chemical one back into an electrical one, usually. Vast majority of the time. So at that synapse can have a particular influence, right? Could be, and so in this case, I'm not just talking about strength. I'm talking about type. And what are the two types of signals that you can get? It's real simple. It's excitation and inhibition. It's almost ridiculous to write these out. In fact, I'm just going to write inhib. So in the end, these 5 things are essential for neural signaling. Now, underneath that is the regulation of the synapse and all that, synaptic release, potentiation, things like that. Okay, but fundamentally, this is all that the nervous system really needs to work with then to shape all the signals in the nervous system. Okay? And that is that. Can you all see this way in the back, or is it a little faint?
How about the front lights are out?
Well, I was going to do that, but then, you know, people in the front might start snoring. Okay. Actually, this pen isn't very good either. I'll try to write bigger. Okay, so that's that. And I think there's, you know, there are a lot of other issues, other little details that you need to know about the axon, dendrites, you know. So the components of a neuron are important to know. But I'm going to leave that to you guys. I think you all know. I think you knew most of them to begin with. So let's jump right in and talk about the membrane potential and the action potential really all at once, okay? And I'll point out really the way that I think of it, you know, and again, it's always step by step. And the first step that you just have to have nailed down, this has to be burned in there, okay? This is the axon or the inside, the outside and inside of the cell, all right? Fundamentally, you just have to have this. Because this is what makes it happen, right? Can you see that at all? No. Now, let me try it. Sorry. Try this. Actually, you know what we're going to do here? We're going to make it really big. You know, there's something wrong with the focus because it looks really clear here to me. What's that?
Sharpie maybe?
I don't have a Sharpie. Okay. I think it's too bright. There, okay. Contrast is very important too, but we're going to get to that when we talk about the retina. Okay. We'll leave it for now. All right, you can see that, right? Okay, so these gradients, you just have to have them, and I'm doing this on purpose, so this would be the inward gradient for sodium and the outward gradient for potassium. So when you think about what's happening during the ax potential, when you think about any phase of this, even with a synaptic potential, okay, it's all going to be driven by these currents. And so either sodium is going to go in or not. Channel's closed, it doesn't go in. Channel's open, it goes in. It'll go in, and for the rising phase ax potential, remember, there's a driving force, so it may not go in even though it's open because you might be at the equilibrium potential for sodium. But you always underneath this, the direction where what that influence is. So when this comes in, it's going to bring in a positive, and when this goes out, these are positive, of course. So you can think of this as, if it's going to go in, it's going to put in positives inside of the axon, and this is going to put positives out. So we have this resting conductance, we say. What that means is there's a channel, there's a particular type of channel, which is not voltage sensitive, that's in the axon, that has this very little but steady conductance. That is, it's open, and when something's conducting and the ions are there and there's a gradient, the ions are going to flow. When ions flow, you get a current. So there's always a steady little potential for a current to flow. Okay? And if you're anywhere away from the equilibrium potential, the ions will flow, right? So they're gonna go out. So conceptually, you can see that this is positive on the outside, right? Not bringing negatives with it, even though overall we said that everything's electron neutral, but don't ever let that confuse you. You know, there's a huge number of ions out here, and even inside. Okay, so there's this big pool, and so you know, the charges balance each other. They're right at this really thin membrane, at this insulator. A few charges accumulate out here because there is this kind of a force. It's not a true physical force, but there is this gradient. Potassium, just in a manner of speaking, wants to go down its gradient. Okay, this is basic physics, entropy, but we don't care. It goes out, it starts to accumulate, and there's a net accumulation of positive charges relative to the inside. So when we record in here, okay, we see that this is a negative value inside. Let me write that down, okay? And ideally, if potassium were it, this would flow and flow and flow until you get that voltage, which is shown here, right? This is a voltage that you can think of is basically balancing this battery, this potassium battery. So it's going out, but you're separating charge. There's a lot of energy in that. It's a potential. It will achieve a certain level, right? Okay. And if it's ideal, it will go to the equilibrium potential for potassium, but it doesn't. But we'll come back to that. We'll put in all the details again of the X potential, right? So that's where it would go. Remember, there's that leak. Okay. But over here, again, sodium being high on the outside, okay, would want to go in. But at rest, those channels are tightly closed. All right. They don't even really spontaneously open. They're just stuck. All right. And they are what we call voltage sensitive, right? But also to the rate of voltage change. So the gate that's closed at rest is closed because the voltage is negative inside. That channel senses that and stays shut. As soon as you start to get away from that, you start to get it more positive, if you will. All right, the gate senses that and it opens, and then where sodium can only go in under normal circumstances. Potassium can only go out under normal circumstances. Okay. We're not going to talk about exceptions. All right. So if you got this has to always be working underneath. All right, when you're thinking now about the X potential. So this is time going that way. So this is if we're sitting here somewhere in the axon, we're a little observer of the axon, right? And we're watching the axon. We're watching the X potential go by, right? So that's why we see sodium first, right? But let's fill in some details here. So we obviously, this scale is volts, but it's actually in millivolts, again, right? The label for that is voltage, obviously. So these are the units here. Usually put them in parentheses. And it's usually V sub M, meaning the voltage in the membrane. Okay. Not terribly important. Now, I'm going to draw in where the equilibrium potential of potassium should be. It's inside negative. Why? Well, when we measure it relative to a proper orientation electronically to the ground, the inside is negative, right? There's negative charges in the inside, but that's by convention, all right? But if you calculate for an electrochemical cell what the potential should be, remember, potential is the voltage. You know, in terms of the Nernst equation, talk about the electromotive force, but it's the voltage, but we express it as E. We get that for the ratio of the concentration of the ions on the outside over the concentration of those on the inside. Again, potassium's lower outside, smaller number than inside. The number's a fraction from the Nernst equation. You're taking the log of that, natural log with some factors in there. When you take a log of a fraction, it is a negative value. So the equilibrium potential is a negative value. All right? But that's not where the resting potential is. It's above that. And why? Already said it. Let me just say this, even if you didn't know what it was, you could calculate very accurately. You knew exactly what potassium was inside and out, and you could calculate very accurately the equilibrium potential. All right, you knew what sodium was, you knew it wasn't. That's not flowing through the voltage-gated channels. All right, voltage-gated ones, and you measure it, and it's not there. It's above it. So we say that is what? Relative to this polarized, negative voltage. It's weird to think of a negative voltage because this is a voltage, this is a voltage, right? It just by convention is negative, okay? So it's polarized, and we're a little above that. What do we say that is? Depolarized, right? But how are you going to get it to be depolarized? That means somehow you've reduced this polarization here between positives and negatives. So the way you're going to have it go this way, right, would be to add a few more positives inside, right? So in the midst of all this, even though it uses sodium, so this would be the voltage-gated one, we have this leak, right? And it's mainly sodium, though, that's going through that leak. So that's happening at rest. And this is happening at rest, potassium going out. So potassium wants to take it all the way down to the equilibrium potential for potassium, all right? But you measure, it's a little higher. And the only way that you can get it depolarized means it has to be a little more positive inside. So potassium can't do that. You need another positive ion going in. Who do you have? You have sodium, right? So it's not very big of a shift. If it was a big shift, that would mean that the leak is significant. The fact that it's a really small shift means that even though this resting potassium conductance is low relative to what happens in the action potential, the leak is much lower than that. The leak is this tiny little leak, I mean, there's very, very few ions going in, but just enough to depolarize, okay? So we say this is where it is at rest, okay? So you're going along, and then something happens. Whether it's a synaptic potential or not, at this point in time, there is an injection of positive current, because that's how you get depolarization, right? Okay, yeah, you could decrease the negative on the inside, but practically, positive current's coming in. So it's coming in from somewhere, okay? It could be a receptor, all right? It could be from your electrode. But at any rate, it comes in, and remember, it goes up kind of slowly. What is that?
Charging.
That's charging. Remember, this is all happening in the membrane. I have to go over it, but we're all real clear. This is all happening on the membrane. That's what I'm drawing here, right? This effect on this capacitor you're charging the capacitor as you go. Yes, it's partially charged down here, but this is charging again because it's reversing. It's starting to put more positives inside, right? Whatever you did to do that. And then we get up to a point, and then the exponential takes off. This is all positive here. I'm not going to write any numbers down. Not important. So we get up to here, and then all of a sudden the exponential takes off. What is that point? How do we define it? Is that the threshold or not? I heard threshold. Who says it takes off at the threshold? Just after. Very nice. So the threshold is just below that, and we define it by, when you're stimulating here, okay, you're causing a voltage change. The voltage sensitive channels are starting to respond, okay? Now I'm not going to draw them in because this is already a mess. But we have now the voltage-gated sodium channels and the voltage-gated potassium channels. But remember, the sodium ones, they respond very quickly. Because this is sub-millisecond. Remember, the whole exponential is like a millisecond, maybe out to 2 milliseconds. So hundreds of microseconds, they're responding. They respond very quickly. So they start to, in a manner of speaking, open, or the conductance for sodium starts to increase. What is that going to do? As you're doing this, sodium is coming in. What is it doing? It's starting to add positive charges. What are positive charges going to do? Depolarize, okay? But there's still this conductance for potassium going the other way. Positive in, positive out. So if that's balanced, what's going to happen? Nothing, right? So that's the threshold. Remember, where the current, we signify by I, for sodium, is equal to that for potassium. Okay? Because both of them are working, but they're counterbalancing each other. So if you take it right to threshold and you let go, where is the voltage going to go from there? You let go, all right? You haven't triggered an exponential. Yes, you've activated the sodium current a little bit, but the potassium's counteracting that. Where's it going to go? It's going to go back down to rest, right? So you could go right to threshold, and then it'll go back, right? Go right to the door, and then you'll walk back in the room. So you have to go through the threshold. That's why it's the point right above, and then it takes off. But why did it take off? You increased the conductance for sodium hugely. Okay, but it continues to increase. Why?
More sodium channels are opening.
More, they are, because permeability is changing. But what continues to drive that? This is why you got to go back to this. Sodium's coming in. Now you've got an imbalance. Now you're here, and the sodium is just a little above the current. What is current? Ions flowing. You got a little more positive going in. That's the hint, right? You go back to this. More positives going in. What's that doing to the voltage? Remember, fundamentally, when you're down negative, and we're still a little negative, right? We're not at zero yet. More positives are coming in. It's more polarized. What do we say that is? So that sodium going in, when it gets the upper hand, is itself depolarizing. So the sodium going in starts to drive the whole thing. It causes a voltage change. More channels respond to that voltage. That causes more voltage change. And so we have this current of sodium going in, right? So that's the current causing, normally we say conductance change G, all right? So I'll just say that will increase, I'm going to write it out, conduct. We say G, right? That causes the polarization, right? Which increases the current. So it feeds on itself. That's why the exponential just slams up to the top, right? Because it's feed forward. And so fundamentally to understand that is, once it gets up their hand, you're putting in more and more positives. More positives are depolarizing. So you have those two pieces, right? Those are your two building blocks. Then it goes all the way up, and we're going to make this idealized, right? It's going to go all the way up and stop at a particular position, and then it will turn back down. No surprise here, right? And then there's this undershoot, which I'm trying to draw carefully. Okay. So why did it go up and stop? Why didn't it just go up there and stay? Well, first principles, it's supposed to be a signal, right, by itself. If it goes up and stays, that's no signal. I mean, it's the start of one signal, right? So we have a discrete signal where it starts and stops, if you will. But it goes to the top, it stops, and there's two basic reasons why it will slow down, if not stop at the top. What is that? I heard potassium channels, but let's say we're just right here. We're right here. We don't know it's going to go back down, right? It does, but we don't know. We're right here, okay? Maybe even right here. I heard sodium channel activation, yes. But even if the channels are open, will it stop? And where will it stop in an idealized situation?
At the equilibrium.
At the equilibrium potential. Because what do we say about the equilibrium potential? That's the point where there's no net flow of ions. So sodium's going in, it's depolarizing, opening more channels, higher conductance, bam, 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 bam. Then it's starting to get up real close to the equilibrium potential for sodium. So the channels are open, right? Okay, maybe they're starting to close, but they are mainly open right near the top, but they're going to stop there because it can't go any farther. Remember, the action potential can only go between the equilibrium potential for potassium and the equilibrium potential for sodium. Why? Because at those points, basically the voltages there are counteracting the gradients. Okay, can't go any farther, not unless you do it artificially. All right. Sometimes they don't go there. So sodium channels are open, but we have what we say is no driving force. So let's add that in. What is the? It's easier, I think, to start talking about driving force again with sodium, right? So what do we say is the driving force for an ion? Okay. Well, fundamentally, we go back up here. It wants to go in, so that's the driving force, right? But at the equilibrium potential, it doesn't flow. So where do we need to be so that the ions will be, in a manner of speaking, driven in? Obviously, they're flowing here, right? They're flowing here big time, away from the equilibrium potential. So this would be the driving force, the distance away from the equilibrium potential. So that voltage value, let's say this is at 0, and this is plus 55 millivolts, which it often is. Okay, so that's the driving force. When you're here, and I'm going to start making a bad mess. This is a smaller driving force. And look at what happens when you're all the way down at rest. Very, very high driving force for sodium, right? Farther you are away. Works on either side of the equilibrium potential, but we don't care. So you're down here, strong driving force. That's that's a contribution to really drive in the sodium, which was adding positive charges, which depolarizes, which opens up the channels because they're sensitive to that voltage change, right? So as you get closer and closer, we get to the point where there's no driving force. So that's another way you could say it, right? That's because the voltage, so now the membrane is polarized, but in the opposite manner, right? So now it is positive on the inside relative to the outside, right? So these two things, they're potentials. The membrane, we say, is polarized. In one case, it's negatively polarized. In the other case, it's positively polarized. So you have a positive voltage that counteracts the equilibrium state, so then we have no net flow. But then they close, sodium channel inactivation, right? And that gate is separate from the gate. Go ahead and draw it in here. It's often shown this way. So there's a gate here, and then there's a gate here. I'm going to go ahead and open this gate. So this is the voltage gate, this is the inactivation gate. Okay. So obviously when you're climbing up the action potential, both gates have to be open, right? And it's so quick that there's a time delay for this inactivation. For this thing, right? Pretty quick. So this gets up here, ions are starting to slow down in terms of their movement, and then the channels close. So at this stage then, the channel is will be effectively open, but that inactivation gate, I better be careful, it's supposed to still be open. Okay, that one closes. So it doesn't matter which one closes, it clogs the pore, ions cannot flow, all right? So it absolutely shuts it off, all right? Because there's that delay, so sodium is going up, what's bringing it down? Don't need to belabor this. That's potassium, right? So if potassium started sooner, this would short circuit it, right? But it happens with a delay. So sodium is dominant, then stops. Even though it was open here and would stop, they all eventually close by inactivation, right? Potassium then now has a huge conductance change because they're voltage sensitive as well. They're sensing that the inside of the cell is now positive, and so these other sets of voltage gated potassium channels, not these, okay, they open in big time. And what are they going to do? What will potassium do? It will try and does drive the membrane potential all the way back down, past rest, all the way to this position. Why did that happen? And this is sometimes a point of confusion. Well, what do we say happened between here and here? Between the equilibrium potential and the actual resting potential. There's a leak, right? So this is a classic example of balance of power, and that's what influences all axe potentials, how they proceed everywhere. Okay. So this potassium, this is a huge conductance change as well. It's taken over. So now the leak is nothing. It's just, remember the leak is even smaller than the resting potassium conductance, right? So it takes over, slams it all the way down here. And what do we say? This is, what do we call this? Well, this is not hyperpolarization, but, okay, hyper and D are all relative, right? So relative to where rest is, this is hyperpolarized, all right? But this is at the equilibrium potential of potassium. Do we just give a little name for this?
Undershoot.
It's up here, it went under, so an undershoot, right? So the undershoot, and contained in that undershoot is what? What's happening to that membrane? So it's the refractory period. During that period of time, you can't get an axe potential, so it is refractory. So why does it come back to rest then? What happened? What happened right here when you're starting to come back? Potassium channels are closing, but the voltage sensitive ones are. So they also inactivate. They open with a delay and they inactivate with a delay. But they inactivate down here after a bit of time because they're sensitive to the fact that the inside is negative and that causes inactivation. The sodium channels sense that the inside is positive, so they inactivate. So these two channels have different nature of their sensors. One senses positive inside, one senses negative. And that's what drives inactivation. So they inactivate, all right? So then what are you left with?
Leak channel.
The leak channel and the resting conductance, right? So they both, we're going to add up together again to give you this resting position. Okay. So how do you get another axe potential? What has to happen to the sodium channel? This only went to rest. So you could fundamentally say that they're closed, right, somehow, right? So the voltage sensitive gate is closed here, but then you wait a little while and then you do this again and it works, right? So what does that mean? Two gates? No, they're not open because if the sodium channel is open here, what would happen? Positive goes in, start to depolarize, right? So the voltage sensitive gate is closed now, right, down here. What about the inactivation gate? It swung back open, right? Because the voltage sensitive gate is going to sense the voltage change and open. When this is opening, the inactivation gate has to be open, otherwise it'll be clogging the channel. So you get inactivation up here for the sodium channels, and a big part of this recovery is that the sodium channels, then the voltage gate closes and the inactivation gate opens. That makes them ready to respond. But they're not open yet. They're waiting for the next voltage change. Okay? So that's the final part of the sequence. Now, currents are flowing. And currents are flowing because we have a relationship between voltage and current. And resistance, in this case, conductance, right? It all follows Ohm's law. Okay. In this case, what is the resistance? That's the channel. It's variable, right? There's a change in conductance, but conductance, relative conductance, you know, if there's high conductance, that means lower resistance, low conductance. Okay, higher resistance. So underneath this, we can plot along here the current. Okay, this is the current, this is the voltage, right? And by convention, we say in versus out, and what's happening here? Well, where's sodium going? Where can it only go? In, right? Who's responding first? Sodium. So there, if we figure out what the current is, as it starts to depolarize, we're getting an increase in sodium current. You already have it right there. It starts to go up, 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 up. And then, near the top of the action potential, it's going to stop, right? I'm just actually, it's much easier just to draw. Okay, there's not going to be perfectly aligned, so don't take me to task. So sodium is going to go in and account for this rise, right? And then it's going to stop at the top of the action potential. Okay, but layer on top of that, there's another current. Yeah, I'm making a mess already. Okay, and actually, it will go up and then go down in reality, right? When we do the voltage clamp, it'll stay up like this, okay? That's clamp conditions. This is real, okay? So we have something going in and a delay going out. Sodium going in, who's going out? Who can only go out? I know some ways they say, well, of course, but you know, you gotta have these in mind. So sodium is going in. All right, let me bring this all the way up. You remember the top of the action potential. So sodium goes in and it stops. Potassium goes in, and then it's going to stop too, because why? We're down at the equilibrium potential for potassium. So when you see this voltage clamp thing, that's artificial, right? In reality, it's also going to be transient too, that potassium current. But so positive goes in, depolarizes, positive goes out, and that will repolarize. Usually, don't talk about hyperpolarization in this condition. We talk about repolarizing. Okay? So those are the currents. So you should be able to have in mind that underneath all this, you can plot out the currents because that's showing where the ions are moving. Now another way, sorry, I mean you have this in your notes. So the other way to think about these various influences is by some kind of signifier for that, okay? So if we have, in this case, the resting, this is just something to help you think about this. So at rest, right, we have a little bit of, I'm just going to make a bar, we have this little bit of potassium going out. That's the resting one, right? But then there's this little leak, but it's really small, right? So we have this leak, but it's sodium. So if you go back to this, and we're right here, okay, and we see that the resting potential is depolarized relative to the equilibrium potential for potassium, we already know that that leak is really weak, right? Because if it was the same strength, if you will, if these bars were truly the same, right? If they were the same, where would this voltage go? It would go up, right? It would land somewhere in between the equilibrium potential for sodium and the equilibrium potential of potassium. But it's not there. So that means this leak is really weak. Already the resting conductance is weak. So now we get this voltage change, right? We get the axe potential. So then we get this enormous, okay, I'm going to put a little bar here. This is going off the chart. Okay, down here. We get this enormous sodium going in, right? So when this is happening, these are still there. The leak's still there. The resting conductance is still there, all right? They're not voltage sensitive, but they're just completely swamped out, right? Then this stops, and then the potassium takes over. So this would be in, this would be out, this would be the rising phase, falling phase, right? So again, that potassium going out, that's swamping these guys over here too. That is why it clamps the voltage down at the equilibrium potential for potassium. Okay. And then this is gone. What do you go back to? This situation. So this resets the voltage back to rest. Okay? So if you like bar graphs, this gives you a better idea, because otherwise we say, well, you know, the conductance is higher. Well, if you look at this, you say, well, this is taken over. It doesn't matter what's going on here. This is dominating. But then it stops. This takes over. It dominates. And then it goes back to that resting condition is low level. But the thing is that resting conductance for potassium is slow and steady. So it doesn't matter how long it takes. That potential still dictates. This gradient still dictates where the voltage will go to. So, you know, this will be a few little ions going. But if you wait long enough, eventually you get to that equilibrium, and then it will be set there. Okay? Questions? It's getting to the point where this is unreadable, I realize. Better? Question?
You can also think about it as a capacitor. What would happen if like the charge accumulated and it didn't fire? So the capacitor didn't discharge.
So you get to threshold, but you don't get past.
Exactly.
Right, so it will charge to that point, and then when you go back, the charge distribution will reverse. Okay. So these ions are all around. So when we're talking about charging here, okay, I'm trying not to. The only point is that charge is accumulating at the membrane. That's why I'm showing it here. Okay, and that's influencing the nature of the signal. I don't really want you to know anymore because we're talking about charging of sodium on the inside now, right? So you know, the membrane is this huge lipid thing relative to the ions, right? So when we're talking about the capacitive charging here, this is sodium on the inside, which is very low. You're adding to that, so that will now discharge and then basically be replaced by potassium. So, okay. And capacitive charging is actually happening all during the axe potential. It's just super fast here because there's so much coming in that this is super fast. You know, there is a little bit of a delay. There's a way to appreciate that because the nature of this rise will depend on the axon. The bigger the axon, the more surface area that charge can have an impact. Okay. Bigger the axon, though, what do we say in terms of resistance for current to flow down the axon? That's a lower resistance. Okay. So that offsets because more ions are flowing down to charge. Okay, so that tends to sort of equalize out. So the capacitance, the only thing I want you to know is that they're because this is probably the synaptic potential, right? So there's a little delay for it to get up there, and that can vary one cell to another. Question?
So I've always thought that depolarization means getting closer to zero from either side of zero. But could you, like, on the rising side of sodium, from zero to equilibrium point, from zero to the equilibrium point of sodium?
Oh, sodium, yeah.
Is that also called depolarization?
Okay. Good question. What do you think? So conventionally, there's, you know, a description in the laboratory that you are depolarized relative to here. But when you go to here, are you polarized or not? No, it's zero. So you go from polarized to not polarized to polarized again, right? So we really are talking about depolarization between here and 0.
Okay.
Okay, and the threshold is always below 0. So we'll keep it simple that way, right? This is not something to lose sleep about. But you point out something essential is that the membrane is polarized here, right? This is polarized, this is polarized, okay? So now it's polarized here and you go in this direction, you could say it's depolarizing, right? We don't say that. It's better to say that it is, causing whatever description you have specifically for the active potential. So it's going up to a positive voltage and going back down to a negative voltage. That's a much better way to think of it. So if you get to here, and relative to this rest position, this is hyperpolarized because this is a bigger thing than that is, right? Now, can you go any farther than this in a nerve cell? Yes, you can. The equilibrium potential for chloride is actually below this. So you can hyperpolarize even farther. Okay. And what do you think that does? If you now, in this case, you need a GABA receptor. Remember GABA receptors conduct chloride? Okay. You have a bunch of GABA receptors around. They put in a lot of chloride. That hyperpolarizes because the equilibrium potential. That's putting in. Remember, chloride is faced in. It's putting in more negative charges. So now you get down to here. What do you think that impact is in terms of being able to induce an action potential? It's going to be harder, right? That's why it's inhibitory. It's pretty close to that. That's just a little bonus, by the way. Just focus on this. But it is. You are correct. That's why I drew these here. These two things. They're polarized in opposite directions. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah. So the guest lecture last night was, or yesterday was last Tuesday. Sorry, was
Okay.
talking a lot about inhibition and excitation. Like, you got really into the details of it. How much of those details do you want to know?
The details of it. Well, I think it was related to the types of receptors, right? So glutamate receptors are excitatory, GABA. There's also glycine receptors that are inhibitory. So that's important to know. It's important to know that glutamate receptors, that the excitatory effect that they have is basically sodium going in, maybe a little calcium. But when sodium goes in, what happens? Depolarizing, that's how they excite. They're driving the membrane potential up toward the threshold, possibly. So if you take the case of the AMPA receptor, it's really good at doing that. This might be an AMPA receptor acting here, firing off an action potential. So it's important to know that it's linked to that excitation. All right. But now we get to the nitty-gritty. Can one synapse do that? What do we say in terms of the average? We talked about this way back in the beginning. So most nerve cells, virtually all nerve cells, have more than one synapse on them, right? Do you remember how many on the average? Even a range? About 1,000. Could be 100 to 1,000. For some reason, the motor neurons in your spinal cord have 10,000 synapses. So one synapse, there's very few places in the nervous system, and not in the mammalian nervous system, where one synapse is going to matter, right? So the overarching concept there is that this all adds together. So there's, even on a given neuron, there's very likely going to be both the positive excitatory stimulation, right? Whether that's through glutamate receptors or not, let's say they are the vast majority of excitatory synapses that are signaling to convey the timing and the pattern and the frequency to the next cell. That's through the glutamate receptors. Okay, so you have some of those synapses, and then you have some inhibitory synapses too. So they sum together, right? They're going to cause currents that are going to go the other way. So you get temporal summation, timing, right? So if the inhibition is timed right, it will really have a big effect. But if it happened way over here, that may do something to the cell, but it's too early or too late. Again, timing's everything. So now with the GABA receptor, again, we haven't really added that in. Why don't we just do that really quickly? So I told you this, but let's just draw it in. Chloride is in adult neurons high on the outside, right? So it's an inward directed gradient, right? So if you get conduction inside, it's going to put in more negative, right? So it's basically taking the potassium potential here and driving it even farther, right? That's why the equilibrium potential for chloride is actually down here. But the point is, so you have a bunch of those synapses, right? So they're driving the potential this way, excitation that way, and if there's more excitation, you know, again, this is a battle of power, and you get up to threshold, you get a response. If GABA wins, or glycine in the spinal cord, you know, the chloride wins, then you don't get an action potential. Okay? I'm not sure about all the details that were presented. Again, it's all timing. They have to happen in a range of time that will influence this. But then now let's say you have a big stimulation. Remember, the bigger the stimulation, the higher the frequency. So you don't just do this, but you have a big stimulation. What are you going to get? You're gonna do this big. So now we have a big stimulation, right? There's some voltage change now. And it'll just, it won't matter, I'm going to draw the action potentials, right? So this is what you cause in the membrane or some kind of synaptic influence did. So you start getting a bunch of action potentials, right? And you get a lot of them when you have this, and then they will stop. Okay. But let's say this is a long period of time, relatively speaking, many seconds. Number in action potentials, milliseconds, seconds in physiological time is a long time, right? So let's say right here, so this was some big excitation. Right here, you had a little brief period of strong activation at the same time, okay, of inhibitory. Yeah, I can't draw it. I'll do it down here. So right here, you have this layered on top of this an inhibitory pulse, okay? But I'm saying these are excitatory synapses, these are inhibitory, so it lasted from here to here. What will happen? System's trying, it still has that strong excitation, but now you've inserted a little bit of inhibition in the middle. Guess what you'll get, right? Let's do the subtraction. Oh boy, I'm gonna make a mess. Go along, it'll stop, and it'll start again, but then the excitation stops. So what have you done? By layering in that inhibition, you've made a pattern, haven't you? This is to help you think about this. You are not going to see this on the test, okay? So you can scribble it down, but get the idea, all right? All right, so are we good with the action potential to this point? Now, we had those challenge questions, right? If inactivation was delayed, what that would do. What would happen if you increased or decreased the gradients? So let's say in another cell the gradient for sodium was much bigger. What does that move? Where can the current drive the voltage to? So think first principles. The equilibrium potential. So if you have this gradient, right, and now you have a bigger one, right, it will move the equilibrium potential, right, because that's dictated by that gradient. So where the action potential can go to, not necessarily the rate of change, right, could be a reason for the nature of this difference. But if you had, in a different cell, you had for some reason, a stronger or larger gradient, that's a battery, that's a potential. This equilibrium potential for sodium will be bigger than this one, right? So that means on the action potential, if these are the two positions, right? So they're not fixed, it's whatever it is for that cell, all right? You could have two different action potential heights. But for that cell, the system is set up that that's fixed, right? So for the cell that has a bigger gradient, it's going to have bigger action potentials, but they'll always be the same. Okay? So let's talk about action potentials, some of the other features of them. Okay? most important thing to think about is conduction and propagation. So it's supposed to be the cell, right? Here's the axon, here's a giant synapse at the end. Okay, but I'm doing this so we can draw here. So here's the axon. So when you are sitting here and over time you're looking, okay, we see that the voltage goes up, it goes down to this undershoot, and comes back, right? That's time. But when we look across the axon, this is a space issue. So if you're here, so first of all, you get all this summation out here, positive, negatives. These are supposed to mean I'll do this, excitation, inhibition. That all sums up, and let's say it's enough to excite. And right at the beginning of the axon, there's a specialized place really where the axon potentials start. Right, what do we call that? Axon hillock. All right. So it starts there, and now you move along and you say, okay, what happened across the axon? If we look at the distribution of movement of ions, how would that look? Well, what's happening first? We're going in this direction, right? So in this direction, if we're right here, I'm just going to put a little box here. Sodium is going to be going in, right? And what's behind? So there's an ax potential moving along here. So the front of the ax potential is sodium, but what's behind? We already said it. Potassium, right? So potassium's going out through its own conductance, right? So what is that sodium doing at the front end? Okay. It's depolarizing up to 0, and then it repolarizes. Okay, but it's depolarizing. You're putting in positive charges, right? Where are they going? I mean, do they just sit there? What do we say about currents? Currents have to go in a circuit, right? Somebody said they're going to spread. Which way? They actually go in both directions. But the key thing is the forward spread, right? Why? Because it's moving that way. Even though it could be spreading backwards, what's the deal behind it? Potassium, refractory membrane, can't respond to that. Only the naive membrane, that is the momentarily naive membrane in front of it, that is membrane that is not refractory, that's going to respond. So you're going to depolarize this patch. What's that going to do? Open sodium channels. All right. A few potassium channels, but with a delay. Gets to threshold, gets above it, then it will then take this little patch of membrane next door in front of it, okay, up to threshold, and then fire the ax potential. So that's just happening smoothly all the way along. That leading edge of sodium entry, okay, it's depolarizing the membrane front. So spread of and propagation of the action potential is due to the fact that you have this forward spread of current, okay? That forward spread of current depends on what we call the cable properties. You know, these are big cylinders, right? Actually, they're little cylinders, but you know, at a molecular scale to the ions, they're huge. So, you know, the bigger the diameter, what do we say? We already said this before. There's the lower the resistance for those ions to flow through. Okay, farther spread of the current. That seems a little counterintuitive, but it really is basically like wire properties in this case, or cable properties. Smaller the wire, the cable, the higher the resistance. It works just as well here. So bigger, fatter axons actually conduct faster. Okay. So we'll come to the other possibilities for increasing this conduction. So that's why it's going in this direction, right? Starting here because you're getting all this summation happening. You know, all these little potentials are coming down here. Well, these are supposed to be the other way. Little potentials coming, they sum up, but that's enough to trigger this ax potential. It happens, but the front end is sodium. So if you were to draw the ax potential across the space, not the time, the space of the axon, right? It will have done this, right? The leading edge will be the sodium going up. The back edge will be potassium coming down, and then an undershoot. Okay, that's why the ax potential, when you just took a snapshot on the axon, okay, it looks backwards, but we were having a discussion yesterday that maybe that's actually forwards. and then we look at it by volt, by time, all right, that this is actually the leading edge, right? This is not the front. This is the front in terms of when it happens, and then the back end is here. Okay? I don't care if you draw an exponential backwards, or at least not for this example. But you should know the leading edge is sodium, and so this gets replicated all the way down the axon. Then questions come up, what happens all the way down here? Okay. Well, the concentration of the sodium-potassium channels down here at the actual synapse, the presynaptic terminal, drop off. All right? They're not really there. But also, remember the potential is going on the surface. It can go down here, collide, and cancel itself. So there's basically only an invading current into the synapse, and then it stops, because obviously if it could regenerate, it would just go back and forth, and back and forth. So nature of the setup is such that it stops at the end of the axon, just the current flows in, opens calcium channels in a way. So let's go over just a couple more things. So we talked about what elements on the nerve cell or in the nerve cell contribute to how well the action potential moves down. By well, I'm really talking about the speed, right? Okay. So we said diameter, right? That's an easy one. Bigger diameter versus smaller diameter. The bigger the diameter, okay, the lower the resistance, faster. So that's diameter. What's the other biggie?
Myelination.
So myelination, how does that work, though? So now we have, I'll just do this axon. Now it's coated. Usually you see it like these little blebs, but it really is coated over it like this, right, all the way around. So you have this really lipid-rich stuff. What do we say the lipid bilayer is? Already. It's a strong insulator, right? Now you've added more insulation. This really is like a wire you wrapped. Okay. But what does that do? And it's right here. So even though I've shown this, let's just blow this up. So here's the forward spread of the sodium current. I was just going to say positive, okay? Well, you know, I've drawn an arrow there, but it actually is doing this all the way from that sodium conductance. Right, so this is coming in, you're starting your circuit, but it's spreading a certain distance, but it's doing that. Okay, it isn't just like going a certain place and going, that's not what happens. This is really a gradient here. Okay, so now you put something there. What have you done? You've insulated against this pathway for the current to go out as it flows down. Okay, so because you're in a manner of speaking, reducing the loss of the current. Okay, then the current goes farther. So that insulation allows the current that's in the axon to stay in the axon as it will and go farther. So that's what myelination is doing. It is increasing the forward spread of current, right? Then there's a third thing. And it's a little bit more general. And this is part of why there are differences in different axons that may be the same size and otherwise seem similar, but you may have a difference in terms of the action potential and its conduction.
Concentration of channels.
So the concentration of channels. So in really the ratio of the sodium channels to the potassium channels, right? So they vary from one axon to another. For some reason you have in one axon a lot more sodium channels. What's that going to do? That's going to have a bigger effect on the voltage change and a bigger effect on the spread of current. So in simple terms, so these are the channels. All right. But this is a little bit more general. Very easy to think, okay, bigger diameter, low resistance, insulated, current flows. All of these are really ending up doing the same thing, increasing the forward spread of current. we just talk very quickly about the synapse and synaptic potentials. We're running out of time here, but okay. Now we're gonna have a nice big presynaptic ending. A little lumpy, that's okay. This is not art class. All right. So this is pre, post. Well, we say presynaptic, but I'm gonna just do this. All right. So when you have an action potential coming down here, okay, and it invades this terminal, all right, what's the primary signal that's triggered that senses that action potential, forward current, and then responds?
Calcium.
Calcium, right? So there's calcium channels all docked here. You know, they're assembled right at the synapse. So calcium is going to come in. It's responding to the voltage change. They are voltage sensitive calcium channels, right? They don't open until they've sensed that voltage. Now that voltage could actually happen independently of the action potential, but that we're going to talk about that way at the end of the course, about other kind of modulators that work this. But it'll come in, it'll interact with the vesicles. Now, does it move the vesicles? Where are the vesicles? What are the vesicles? What do we call them? Synaptic vesicles, right? So there's all kinds of vesicles in all cells, right? But these have unique features. Okay. So if we blow this up, then oh, that looks a little better. Where are the vesicles? This is the synaptic cleft. Okay. What do we say they are? Or not? They are docked, right? They are down, ready to go. There's a calcium channel. In fact, they're docked right next to the calcium channel. Okay. How are they docked? Who are the three main players for docking and getting the vesicles ready to go? There's a fourth player. We'll come to that one. That's the calcium sensor. Remember the names? Important to know. Look them up. So on the vesicle, now we'll blow the vesicle up. Okay. These are proteins, right? So proteins are mediating this interaction. So we have one protein here on the vesicle. So as a very general name, what do we call that? You know that from CNP, right? So that's the V snare, because this is a vesicle, so it's a snare. This acronym was on purpose termed snare to trap, to catch. Okay? That wasn't just an accident, all right? So that's here, all right? Do you remember the name of that one? No, the V snare. So that's synaptobrevin. I'll put it up here because I don't have any room. And what's the V snare interacting with? I've already heard it. With the T snare down on the membrane. T snare or snares? Is it one? Two. Snap 25 and syntaxin. Know these guys, okay? These two guys here, they're all wrapping together. So they dock, right? And remember they wind around each other. What is that? What happens then? So they dock here initially, right? This would be docking. I'll just put dock in my room. But then they wind down and they bring that vesicle real close. So it's almost ready. What do we call that? Priming. Okay, so when they zipper, then they prime. Okay. And then there's one other character in here. All right. I'm just going to put him here as a big blob. So there's one last character. This is the calcium sensitive protein that's putting the brakes on. Do you remember that one? That's synaptotagmin. So those are the four characters you need to know. Okay, that's a height. So this is the guy that calcium comes in. So it's putting the brakes on, right?
What do you mean it puts the brakes on?
When it's bound, the snares are primed, okay, but you don't get fusion. Okay? Or do you? Without calcium, do you get fusion? Yes, you do. Once in a while. Very rarely. When that happens, you get fusion. You get a little bit of neurotransmitter coming out, and you get a little blip. Remember these little blips that Werner Katz saw? What do we call those? Those little blips are recording on this side. Okay, I'm out of ink. Of course I'm out of ink. It's an old pen. So if this is a, this is a giant synaptic potential here, but now you just sit around and you record, and you have a real high signal to noise. And you see these little blips. And we now know that those are spontaneous. They're happening on their own. Okay? That's a spontaneous fusion of a primed vesicle. Even though the brake's on, sometimes brake comes off, right? So you get a little bit every now and again. Very small relative to the full synaptic potential, so it's not going to trigger an ax potential downstream, right? It's happening all the time. Little blip. So the system really is primed, and sometimes the brake fails. Fortunately, only once in a while. But that tells you right off the bat that you have all the goodies here that you need to make that membrane fuse, make a fusion pore, and have the neurotransmitter come out. And a fusion pore is just like a channel, but it's a channel made up of these elements here. So it's ready to go. Okay. And elsewhere in the cell, there's no break, right? So you have other snares, from the ER through the Golgi. Remember, there's vesicles that move between membranes and move cargo between membranes. They just bind and they work, right? Here, the big deal at the nervous system, at the synapse, okay, is that the brakes are on. So now calcium comes in, the brake comes off, and now this releases these guys. And it turns out that it isn't really causative. So it's probabilistic that increase that more and more vesicles will fuse. So when the calcium comes in, it may or may not cause that to fuse. So when you're in your reading, you may have run into this probability element. Don't worry about it. Okay? Fundamentally, all you need to know is that this is one of these small, spontaneous, miniature excitatory, in this case it's that we call it excitatory postsynaptic potential. I'll just write potential here. Potential is a voltage change. It's a little voltage change, a little depolarization, okay? Spontaneous, that's due to the fusion of a single vesicle. Without going through the whole thing, because we're running out of time, remember that this is the building block then that makes this synaptic potential here, okay? And the way we know that is if we lower the calcium down, way down, we don't get rid of it, we get lower it way down, and we stimulate, then we start to see these, we can drive them. And under the right conditions, we can put a little more calcium, they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that this will build up that. So what do we call this element? Elemental unit, I should say. Do you remember? It's a building block for the whole thing.
Quantum.
It is the quantum. Know that, okay? The quantum is the fusion of a single vesicle. It doesn't matter whether that happened when there was the full amount of calcium there. So that means that, this is built up of all these little guys, right? So there's still the building block, right? They just sum together. That's why it's important. So you talk about temporal summation, right? So it's happening on a microscopic scale. More vesicles, more vesicles, more vesicles, they add up. Then you get a big synaptic potential. Voltage changes enough, get an ax potential, right? Okay. So the quantum is the building block. So I haven't gone through this whole deal about how this was described, but again, you can see that if that's a single vesicle, vesicles mediate a fusion. Calcium comes in, takes the brakes off on all the vesicles, then they're going to start fusing like crazy. But it's timed, right? It's timed relative to the ax potential. It's timed to that calcium entry, right? So when the ax potential comes down, that blip, there's a blip of calcium coming in, a cascade then of vesicles that are released, and that's why you get this potential, which is in register with that axe potential, and hopefully will then cause so quantum, I want to make sure that we at least cover that. Hang around, we're going to have to get out of here, but if people want to ask some questions. And definitely if you have questions later or before the exam, not 10 minutes before the exam, but go ahead and send me an email, and I'll try to get right back to you.